not fine eggshells. The egg white really was what did it, evidently. And there was the waste materials would rise to the top of the syrup, and she would skim them off, and then can the syrup. Some of the syrup she canned, but then she would boil down, just like we make candy. Only she didn't have any thermometer to go by. She just had to keep taking a little bit out in the dish and stirring it until finally it would get to the soft ball stage. And then she would stir it, and this would make your soft maple sugar. Now that's a real job to have to beat that. She had no electric beater. No one had ever heard of such a thing. She had to do it by hand. And she just made gallons of that soft sugar. And all through the year, she used primarily maple sugar in all of her cooking and baking, and it was always on the table, that and the syrup. Then if you wanted to have the hard maple sugar cakes, then you boiled it down to another stage, the hard ball stage, and then that had to be stirred, and then it would be put into. Sometimes she had little forms that she would put it into, and but she wouldn't make very much of that. But it was a very busy time of year. But during that time, it was also a fun time of year because we were always sugaring off. And by sugaring off, I mean we took the syrup and boiled it down to this soft boil stage and stirred some of it and ate it out of our dish. Remember, there would be a whole bunch of it. They always invited the Sunday school classes, and Carrie would bring some of her classmates up from Little Valley, and they'd have a sugaring off party. Or we would have pans of snow packed tight into the pans and boil syrup to the wax stage. And then with your spoon, you dribbled the syrup all over the top of this snow, and it would make wax. And then you would take your fork and wind it and eat it that way. My mother, believe it or not, always served pickles with that. It sounds terrible, but you know, people began doing it because it took away that very sweet taste out of your mouth that you would get if you ate nothing but the sugar. Mm-hmm. And so she was quite noted for that. Another thing that my mother was noted for was her bread, her graham bread. We always had 3 kinds of bread on the table. There was the white bread that she had made. There was salt rising bread. And then there was always this graham bread, and she had made it with whole wheat flour, or graham flour as we called it in those days. Now if you go to the store and buy graham flour, it's whole wheat flour. And but so few people made that graham bread that through the years I have had people say to me, I'd give anything to have a slice of your mother's graham bread. She was quite noted for that. During the summer months, the milk was all taken to the cheese factory down by Little Valley. Now that meant a 4-mile drive for my father. After breakfast, as I told you in another unit, we had the morning devotions, and my father always prayed and read from the Bible. Then, when they started the day's work, somebody had to drive to Little Valley with the horse and wagon and take the milk down to the cheese factory. And then they would always bring back some whey for the pigs. I can remember going with my father many times, riding down with him, and of seeing the fog over Little Valley when it would be so clear up on the hills. And I always think of early morning. I always think of Little Valley as being foggy. They have a great deal of fog there. In the wintertime, they dried off most of the cows, and what milk was kept at home, Mother put it into big round, we called them milk pans. Now, I think those milk pans held about 12 quarts. And they were big around, so that it made a big surface at the top. The cream would rise to the top, and then and the milk would sour. And then she would skim the cream off with a skimmer. The skimmer was shaped something like a seashell, a scalloped seashell, only it had holes in it. And she would skim off the cream, and then, of course, turn the cream into butter. And whatever the family didn't need, she would take to town and sell. I imagine the family ate pretty near all that she made. And I think that at that time, probably if she got 10 or 15 cents a pound for it, she got a good price. It was usually packed into a jar, or a crock, as we call them, a butter crock. And then from the milk that was left, she made cottage cheese.
We're not sure what caused that power failure, but excuse us, the whole house went black and then everything came back on. We were talking about the cottage cheese and milk whey and
Yes.
how all that was used.
Mm-hmm. The parties that we had at that time were always lots of fun, and people always looked for it. Now, sometimes they had these parties at the house, and sometimes they go over to the sugar bush and have them over there, depending upon who came and the weather and so forth. But I can't remember just when, but I would have said previous to 1910. They had a very severe windstorm, and it blew over a lot of the maple trees there, and so they never made maple sugar after that. I think they felt that there just weren't enough to pay. But it was a busy time when the sap was running rapidly. Sometimes my father or one of the boys would stay over at the sugar house all night to boil it, because after it stood, it would ferment. And so they had to keep on working at it. But it was a lot of work for my father and boys and for my mother to take care of it as it came down. Now it's all done at the sugar house, and of course everything is scientific, and they don't have to guess at what they were doing. Sunday nights, they always had to get the reservoir in the kitchen stove filled, and the wash boiler on the stove and filled with water, so that Monday morning my mother could do the washing. All the clothes had to be boiled in those days, that is, all the white clothes. And it was really a job with a wood fire to heat all the water that had to be used. Then she had to have water, of course, for the wash tubs, and it was an all-day process, scrubbing these clothes on a washboard, and then hanging them out, and in the wintertime, they'd freeze before you could get them on the line. Mm-hmm. And I can remember as a girl of going out, to take them down, and my fingers would get so cold. They usually strung the clothesline in the front yard, and that was where Mother dried her clothes. I recall the first washing machine that Mother had. ran by, there was a handle on it, and we would have to take hold of this handle and pull it back and forth. And we thought that was wonderful. So she didn't have to scrub only part of it, the laundry. And some of the real heavy stains she would have to. Mother always hung out a nice-looking wash. In those days, people talked a great deal about their neighbor's wash. Whether a woman hung out a nice, clean, neat-looking wash, and whether she hung it nicely on the line. You didn't put a sheet in a pillow slip and a towel and another sheet. You put your sheets together and you put your towels together. And there seemed to be a way for doing those things. I spoke about the oil, having the oil lamps. That was one thing on Saturday. Saturday morning, all the oil lamps, the chimneys had to be washed, and the lamps filled, and that happened to be my job. I wasn't very enthusiastic about it.
Good starter, but a poor finisher, right?
Yes. And I just, but I can remember so well, I dreaded Saturday morning because all of those lamp chimneys had to, and they had to be nicely wiped and shine. You didn't leave a lot of lint on them. When you did it well. They, I remember the first telephone we had, because I came home from school and discovered that it had been put in. And my brother Charlie and Louis and Thora, my cousins, were with me. And Father and Mother were not home, so nothing to do. We're going to have to use that telephone. So I called up Mary Jepson, a girl that I knew in Little Rock. And she wasn't there. And I told her mother who I was. So, of course, I didn't tell my father and mother that we tried to use the telephone. And a couple of hours later, when they were home, Mary called back. And
now you're in big trouble.
And so father and mother knew that we had been using the telephone. So we had a few instructions about how the telephone was to be used. In those days, the telephone was always on the wall, and you had to crank it. You take the before you took the receiver off, you would crank it. The people on the line, if you wanted to call them, you see it. Whenever your phone rang, it rang in all the homes that were on that particular line. Not just your own, but on all the lines. That made it convenient for people to listen in to what you were talking about, which was against the law and still is.
Mm-hmm.
But there wasn't such a lot of that done. I remember, though, later in 1931 of being in Kansas. I was out on a farm there, and the telephone rang, and my cousin answered, and she stood there and just listened. And when she hung up, she said, such and such a store is having a sale. I said, what do you mean they're having a sale? Oh, she said that was the party line number that rang. It seems that they had a number for the whole line, and everybody would answer. And then when everybody was on the line, why, the man at the store would tell them what was on sale for the weekend.
All right.
And then another day, she said, she spoke about Cousin Milton having been taken very ill one morning about 4 o'clock. And about her calling the doctor, and in no time, some of her neighbors were there. And I said, well, how did they know? Well, she said they listened in when I called the doctor. So it had its good points, and especially out there in the where the neighbors were so far apart. I could see where it really was an asset rather than a liability for neighbors to listen in on the telephone.
Right.
Later on, of course, we finally had the telephone that we could put on our desk or on the table. But in the very beginning, I don't recall that there were any except those that were attached to the wall. Then we had, and of course, with both of those, we had to call the operator first and give her the number, and then she would call whoever you wanted. So you had to have your neighbors' and friends' telephone numbers just the same. And if you didn't know them, why, the telephone operator was supposed to. I was talking with a woman who was a telephone operator in Gold Valley one time, years ago, and she said that they had to memorize all of the telephone numbers. There also, for many years, there were different telephone companies, and you could only call the people who had telephones in the company in which you to which you subscribed. If your neighbor next door subscribed to a different company, why, you couldn't call them and they couldn't call you. They sometimes you went to your neighbors to call somebody, or they came to your house because they couldn't reach them. And then, of course, later on, they had the dial system so that we could dial direct. Now, that has its advantages and disadvantages, too. In Salamanca, we had the dial system there about the last of any of the communities there in western New York, due to the fact that they had put in fairly new equipment fairly late in Salamanca, and so they used it until it had to be replaced. That, too, in some ways I liked it better, and in some ways I didn't. In a place of 10,000 people, you don't know everybody, of course, but you know people pretty much by name. You've heard of them, perhaps. Now, the telephone operators, I didn't know personally, but 2 or 3 of them. But those girls were wonderful. I often said that if anything should happen to me in the night, and I was alone, if I could get that telephone receiver off the hook, even if they couldn't hear anything, I knew they'd send somebody to investigate. Another illustration. One day, right in the middle of office hours, my phone rang, and it was the operator. And she said, "Dr. Wilcox, some man just called, and he said, call Dr. Wilcox and tell her to come quick." And she said, it's on a party line, and he hasn't hung up the receiver. He's just gone and left the telephone. And she said, so we have no way of knowing. Well, I said, do you know what line it was, what number it was, the number of the line? And she told me that. Well, it just so happened that the daughter of this man was a friend of mine, and I knew her telephone number. And I said, well, I think that's Mr. Martin, and thanked her. And I knew that there must be some real emergency, or he would never have called that way. So I immediately, they lived just 2 or 3 blocks from the office. I jumped in my car and went up, and sure enough, here was Mrs. Martin on the porch floor. And I don't recall now whether she was unconscious, whether she had fallen from the trip, or just what had happened, but it was a real emergency. That couldn't happen today with the telephone as we have it today. And of course, there was no, and they, if I hadn't realized that that was their telephone, of course, advantages and disadvantages in
both ways.
Yes. Father was always very much interested, father and mother, in the church. And then father was, connected with a school there for many years. He was the, I'm not school superintendent, they didn't call him that. But anyway.
Headmaster?
No. He had to see to hiring the teachers and in the district, and school trustee, they called him. And he would be like the chairman of the board. I know that while I was in school, one of the teachers wanted to start a library, and Father was very much for it. Any progressive thing that he was always for it. He was always interested in the things of the community, and he was Justice of the Peace at one time. And as I have looked over the records, I find that the Wilcoxes have been listed as, they've held the offices of Justice of the Peace, and my brother Bert was town clerk for many years, and then Wilma followed him for many years after that. And in the early church records, we find that the Wilcoxes are listed for so many of the organizations, and as chairman or president or in connection with it. And I have tried to make out a list of some of those that we will have to put in with the other information about the family. Of course, there was no motorized machinery on the farm. We had horses for everything. The nearest of anything that was motorized was the threshing machine. Once a year, people would come with a threshing machine to thresh the oats. Very little wheat was ever raised around there, and it would be more the oats and some barley and buckwheat that would be raised, and there would be somebody in the community that would own a threshing machine, and they would have this steam engine. It had to be moved with horses, but after it was once in place, the steam engine would be connected with the threshing machine, and then the grain would be hauled to the threshing machine and threshed. And those were always great days. All the neighbors came to help, and Mother would have to prepare dinner at noon, supper at night for them, as long as they were there. And in those days, you could always plan on it that it would break down. It was not perfected enough so that they might be there 2 or 3 days. Mm-hmm. I remember one woman telling about the threshers coming into their house, and they had a big farm, and she had them for several days, and finally her husband told her that the noontime would be the last, and they would be gone. And so she cooked him a good meal at noon. And after a while he came in and he said, "I'm sorry, but they're going to be here for supper." And it usually meant cooking for 10 or 15 people. Mm-hmm. And she said, I had used up everything that I had. And so she said, I didn't know what in the world I was going to give them. And she said, I finally decided that I'd give them Johnny Cake and milk. Of course, Johnny Cake down here is called cornbread. Cornbread. But we always call it Johnny Cake and milk. Well, she said, the men all said that tasted so good to them, and they appreciated it, even if they had been having, chicken dinners and beef and so forth. And but it was a busy time for both the men and the women on the farm. They as I say, we had no automobiles. I remember my first automobile ride, which was probably about 1905. Some of us came out of school, this little country school, one afternoon, and there was an automobile coming up the road. Of course, there were no paved roads at that time. And as I think back now, I know this man had a chauffeur. And he was the chauffeur, of course, was driving, and the man was sitting in the back seat. The top was down. They had folding tops at that time. The top was down, and he had on a cap and a duster. That was the proper thing to wear in those days. Well, he pulled up and stopped, and he wanted to know if we'd like to have a ride home. Well, of course, we like to have a ride in an automobile.
Mm-hmm. It's like, would you like to go to the moon?
Yes. Unfortunately, our place was the nearest, so my ride was the shortest of any of them. But it was my first automobile ride. And I hope that man knows what
a thrill.
What a joy he gave to us kids that afternoon, giving us a ride. And I'm sure he does, because I think we were all speechless. And I know our eyes must have just been sticking out of our heads. And the next car that I recall, a man from Olean, whose parents lived on a farm next to us, had an automobile. And he used to come out there. And I recall that he was able to go from the farm to Little Valley, which is 4 miles, and he could make it in 16 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just unbelievable. I don't recall that I ever had a chance to ride with him, but I can remember wishing I could.
Right.
Automobiles seldom ever were able to make the top of the hill, there, Miller Hill, without stopping at our place to get water to put in the radiator. In the very early days, it was to be expected. And in the early days of the automobile, if we heard one coming, we rushed to the door in order to see it. And just like later on, we used to rush to see the airplane go over. Now we accept them as just everyday things. And so would you like to take a little break here?
Yeah, we probably should. I tell you what we'll do. We'll, rather than start another unit, we'll just pick this one up. The
Yes.
topic is the same. We'll just pick
That's
it
right.
up, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it'd be a good idea.
Of course, by 1901, Walter left for college. My brother Walter, I think, probably was, shall I say, the quietest one of the family, but he enjoyed fun just as much as the rest, but perhaps didn't make quite so much as some of the others. He used to love to tease me as a little girl. A very small child, I could remember so well of his teasing me about various things. But one thing he did that I just loved would be, I'd run up facing him, and he'd take hold of my hand, and I'd walk up the front of him and sit on his shoulder. And I just loved doing it, and I can remember so well his coming home one day, and I had grown so tall I couldn't do it anymore. And I was just heartbroken.
Crushed, huh?
I was just crushed because I couldn't walk up to the front of Walter anymore and sit on his shoulder. And of course, after he left home and went to college, he was never back home after that. That year, Bert had been west to Yakima, Washington, and had spent a couple of years, I believe, on the farm there that our Uncle Charlie had, the fruit farm.
And Helen, out of curiosity, at that point in time, how long a trip was it from Salamanca to Yakima, Washington?
To go from home out there, it would take, you would go to Randolph to get the train, and go to Chicago, and change there, and it would be at least 3 nights and 4 days. And of course, no airplanes.
No, certainly.
Nobody dreamed at that time that you would ever be able to make it in a few hours. So Carrie, of course, went to high school in Little Valley and stayed with our Aunt Lucy and Aunt Mary, who were living there then. And I started in the country school at when I was six and a half. My mother never liked to have her children start school early. She liked to keep them home, and they had to go at 7. They had to be in school at 7. And so I started in school, and at that time, it was just at the time that they started doing a few things in school that apparently had never been done before. For instance, I remember in first grade that the teacher had us make some paper chains that we hung in the window, and that was just great.
Mm-hmm.
One of first or second grade, also the teacher started giving us nature study, and we made scrapbooks, pressed flowers and leaves and so forth, and that was unheard of before doing something of that nature before that. They, of course, it was a little country school. I suppose we had 10, 15 pupils in it, and all subjects were taught up through the 8th grade. And what you didn't get in your own class, why you heard the other classes have. Really, children learned a great deal from the other classes as the teacher was hearing them. There was always a stove in the center of the room that heated the school building. And many times the teacher would start the fire in the morning, or maybe she would hire somebody, I suppose, a nickel or a dime a week to get there early. And I know my brother Charlie used to do that sometimes. One reason why I recall one morning he and I were having to do the dishes and at home, and he didn't want to do the dishes in the first place. In the second place, he was in a hurry to get over to the school and start the fire. So he started out, and my mother discovered it about the time he got out to the roadway, and I can hear her calling him yet. And of course, childlike, I was just tickled to think that she called him back, and of course, he wiped the dishes, but he wasn't in a very good mood doing it.
You have to know that I find that the picture of you in pigtails and him in knickers, probably, at odds with each other washing the dishes, that's a really humorous thought for me. It really
we were. A good many times. He was just enough older, that he thought he could boss me around. Mm-hmm. And I didn't take to that so very kindly. And so, as I said, he really turned out to be a very nice man.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought a great deal of him.
Mm-hmm.
But
later on.
Later on. But just at that time, I wasn't so sure about it.
Right.
My sister Carrie, of course, she was still older than he. And she was, as a girl and as a woman, she was very quick in doing things. Now, she wasn't a person who ever impressed you as being in a hurry or rushing, but she just accomplished things so much more rapidly than the average person. It was just unbelievable. And she was very annoyed is her sister Helen, because I couldn't do things as fast as she thought I should.
We all know you're a good starter, but a poor finisher.
Well, no, just anything that I did, I was just so much slower in doing it. When she reached the age of 60, 65, she began to complain about being slow. And I said, now, Carrie, don't ever let me hear you complain about that. I said, all of your life, you have been faster than the rest of us. I said, you're now slowing down to where the rest of us have been all our lives.
Been the whole time.
And so I said, don't complain about it. Don't complain about it. But I can remember her being annoyed with me because I was slow doing things. But she was a very efficient person, and every move counted. But she was never in a hurry. Just one of those individuals that could do it. And she was an amazing person. She did a great deal of work in the auxiliary of the American Legion. The big hospital at Bath, New York, was not too far from Canasteel, where she and Ed lived, and she held office in the auxiliary, and they used to go up there, and she would have charge of perhaps the Christmas parties and the Christmas gifts for the hundreds of veterans that they had there in the hospital at that time. And she did so much work in the Red Cross, and in the, she was a member of the Eastern Star and Rebecca's, and was always a leader, and so very well liked, and lots of fun, always lots of fun. And of course, during the years there, 1905, Walter graduated from Syracuse, and he went to work for one of the electrical companies in Pittsburgh. And then later, when he and Catherine Lewis were married, they went to Berwyn, Illinois, and that was where their daughter Elizabeth was born, their first child. Of course, Bert and his first wife, Jenny, had been married about 1901 or 2, as I said, and went to live down on the farm there below Napoli. And Arthur was born in 1902. I was very much incensed with the fact that I was his Aunt Helen. Mm-hmm. And I refused to be it until I was as old as my Aunt Helen. But it didn't seem to change things any. In 1908, in December, my brother Charlie and Velma were married, and they took over the farm, and we temporarily, Father and Mother and Ike and I, went down and lived with Bert, because Jenny had since passed away. And we lived there that winter. Well, the next fall, the four of us went on a trip west, and we were gone for about 8 months. And we visited in Elgin and Illinois, and then we went on to Yakima. And Uncle Charlie was no longer living there, but his son Bert was. And we visited there. I guess we were there 2 or 3 weeks. Then we went on down to California, where Uncle Charlie was living then, my Uncle Charlie. And there were several other, some of the Bert descendants were living in California, and we visited them. Then when we came back, Father bought a place in Little Valley on 8th Street, and we moved there. The house had been built by the people from whom Father bought the place, and they had lived in it just a very few years when we moved in it in 1910. At that time, Father built a barn on the place and bought a horse and buggy, and of course a few people, just a very few people had an automobile by this time, but there's still just the dirt roads. In high school, at that time, we had to have so many credits to graduate, and we had to take algebra and geometry. Those were both required. We could go on to trigonometry if we wanted to, but we had to take algebra and geometry. We had to have 4 years of English, and we had to have 2 years of some foreign language. I took Latin, and I also took German. They were teaching German in the schools at that time. It was later taken out of the schools on account of the First World War. Very foolish thing, but nevertheless it happened. At that time, they started teaching what we call manual training in the high school there. It was the first that they had anything of that nature. And they permitted the girls to take it too if they wanted to, so I took it. Fundamentally, I don't think that I am of a pioneer nature, but it seems to me that I've always been pioneering all my life.
You're just a woman in the right age to be doing something women have never done before.
So I took manual training, and I still have the footstool that I made for my Aunt Lucy.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
She had fallen and fractured her hip, and so I thought it would be nice to make a footstool for her. Strangely enough, not more than 15 years later than that, someone came into my brother-in-law's office, and they saw this stool. She was an antique dealer, and she said, "Well, that's a real antique." And she wanted to buy it, and my brother-in-law said, well, he had no idea how old it was. He knew it was one that my Aunt Lucy had, but he had no idea how old it was. He didn't know that I had made it. And so when he told me about it, I said, well, if you ever have a chance to sell that as an antique again, let me know. I'll be glad to do it. But I still have a stool. And I also took mechanical drawing, and we had to make the blueprints. And I've always been glad. I learned how to use a few tools, and it gave me a little foundation there that, and especially the mechanical drawing. I have always been glad that I had the course in that, because after when I went to study home decoration and home construction, of course I made good use of it. Mm-hmm. When we moved to Little Valley, in those days, we had electricity. However, it was turned off at midnight and came out at 6 o'clock in the morning. So no one had electric refrigerators or anything of that nature. And if you went anywhere, you planned to get home by midnight because there would be no street lights from then on. I don't remember just when they started having it full 24 hours, but it would have been shortly after that. I went into the 8th grade when we moved to Little Valley, and then was there until 1915 when I graduated from high school. Meanwhile, I had made plans, to go back. That was 1910 that we went there, and in 1911, Father passed away. He had a heart condition for some time. I don't know whether my mother thought that it was a heart condition. He was always complaining of indigestion. He would have these awful spells of pain. I know now that he was having some coronary difficulty, but in those days know so much about coronary heart disease. And he had this very severe attack of pain one night, and he was very ill all night and passed away the next morning. And that was in August of 1911. So, but we remained there in Little Valley, and until I graduated from high school. And as I say, meanwhile, I had decided that I was going to study home economics. Well, that was a new thing. As far as I know now, there were only 3 schools that were teaching it. Columbia University, Cornell, and Mechanics Institute in Rochester. And I chose to go to Rochester. Of course, now, the person, you couldn't go by train to Rochester, but in those days, that was the only way you did go. So I went by train to Rochester, and in the fall of 1915, to start the course in home economics. In those days, when you graduated with a degree, well, we didn't have a degree, but when you graduated in this particular course, it was called the normal course. They had what we call the diamond ring course. That was a course for girls who were going to be married, and it was a 1-year course. And they went there to learn how to cook and keep house. But the normal course was a 3-year course to prepare you for teaching. And you had to take both cooking and sewing, but you could specialize in one or the other. So I chose the cooking rather than the sewing. But I had to do considerable of the sewing as well, and we had to take millinery. This was in the days when a woman would not think of going over town without a hat on and her gloves, and you always wore a hat to be well dressed. So it was while I was there that the First World War broke out in 1917. Of course, it was 1914 overseas, but we didn't get into it until 1917. And then every woman was knitting. They knitted scarves and helmets and sweaters. Everywhere you went, you took your knitting. There were even some churches that the women knitted during the Sunday morning service. My sister Isa had, the Red Cross would bring her bolts of cloth to her home, and she would cut out hospital gowns, pajamas, and things of that nature, and then they would be taken to the Red Cross headquarters there in Little Valley, and the women would in turn either work on them there or take them to their homes and make them. And also, in that First World War, they made many of the bandages. Of course, later on, it was done commercially, but at that time, they made the bandages. They would buy the gauze and make the bandages and send them in. It just changed the whole way of life for people, and it also changed our course. In our senior year, when we were supposed to have been having instruction in gourmet cooking, we were trying to learn new ways to use the wheat substitutes. If you bought, everybody who bought a 5-pound sack of flour also had to buy 5 pounds of either cornmeal or barley or any substitute. Well, people didn't know
what to do with it.
No, they didn't know how to use it so much. And so we were trying out new recipes for the things to have. In our senior year, we had to put on what we call the faculty luncheon. The class would have to serve luncheon to certain members of the faculty whom they would invite on that particular day. So the day that our group had to serve, we had a new recipe that we thought we could make some good cornbread. And when we went to take it out of the tin, it just, as I remember, it was more like mush than it was like bread. So we took it, and what did we do? We put it into a fry pan, cut it as near as we could into pieces and put it in a fry pan, and cooked it until it was firm enough that a person could hold it in their hand to eat it, you know. And one of the girls who was having to act as waitress that day came out of the kitchen in stitches. And she said, "What do you suppose Miss Benedict asked me?" And I said, "What?" She said, she wanted to know the name of that bread. She says, I told her it was spoon bread.
Spoon bread.
So, and then during that last winter, one Sunday morning, one of the girls came to me and wanted to know what my brother-in-law's first name was. She was referring to Carrie's husband, Ed Crossman. And I said that it was Edgar. I said, why? I was so surprised because she didn't know them. Well, she said there was an article in the paper about some officer at Waco that had been seriously hurt, and his name was Crossman. But it was James Crossman, and I said, no, his name is Edgar. And then after she left my room, I got to think about it, and I thought, why, his name is James Edgar. And so then I went to find out, and it was he. He was an MD, you know, and he had gone into the Army and was stationed here at Waco, waiting to be shipped overseas. One day, he was ordered to go into town to see the wife of one of the other officers who was ill. And so someone with a motorcycle with a sidecar took him in. And on the way in, they, in order to avoid a collision with the car, they went up over a curb, and Ed was thrown out, and his head hit against the hydrant. And so he was in very serious condition, and he was unconscious. I don't know for how long, but for a long, long time. Aunt Carrie came down to Texas to be with him, and he had a fractured shoulder. And as a result of this, he was nearly blind. No, in one eye. I think the vision was affected a little bit in the other one, but the one was badly affected. And it was months before he was able to return. When he was discharged, he never was able to go on. And it was such a rare case that it was written up in some of the medical journals. But he had always hoped to go on with surgery, but he was unable to do so because of the restriction in his shoulder, his arm, and his eyesight. And so that although he could continue with his private practice, but he couldn't do any major surgery. Then I graduated in June of 1918 from Mechanics Institute. I still had no position, but because there were very few schools that were teaching home economics at that time. And we also were rated for the employment office at the school according to our grades. And we would not be recommended for a job that they felt wasn't paying as much as we were worth, or vice versa. And so anyway, something happened that spring that before I graduated. It was one of those things in life that as you look back over your life, there's certain things that happen or don't happen, and you wonder what your life would have been if it had been the opposite. During this period of time when we were eligible to be looking for jobs, they called me from the employment office one day at the college and wanted to know if I would be interested in going to a school in Georgia. Well, of course, Georgia was an awful long ways from home at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And but I found out that it was a school for poor whites, and what they wanted was somebody to teach home economics, but also to be a house mother for some 15, 20 girls in one of the cottages. And I finally said that I would go if they wanted me. So my application was sent in, and had been accepted. Well, there at school, there was a bunch of us, about 9 of us, that were real good friends, and we had all sorts of fun pulling tricks on each other. And one day, a couple of the girls came over, and they said, "Helen, they want you, Mrs. Fisher wants you over in the employment office right away. There's a man here from Georgia." And so I quick got into my uniform, and fixed my hair, and well, they wanted me to hurry, and she wanted me to come just as soon as I could. And I went over. Fortunately, before I went into her office, I could see through the window, and here sat a great, big, black man. I don't know where he was from, but I knew he wasn't from that school because it was for poor whites, and I knew those girls had seen him in there. They just thought that would be good. So, well, anyway, we had a lot of fun over it. But after they had accepted me, they discovered how young I was. That is, in comparison to what they wanted. And so they wrote back and said they were sorry they couldn't take me because they wanted an older woman at house mother. Well, Mrs. Fisher wrote back to them that she thought I could handle the situation all right. But they absolutely refused, and so that was the end of it. Several years later, I believe it was in the Reader's Digest. This must have been 10 or 15 years later. I picked up the Reader's Digest one day, and here was an article about the Martha Berry College in Georgia. And as I read it, it kept ringing a bell in my mind, and suddenly I remembered that was a school where they wanted to hire me, and had they done it, it would have been I would have been in the early days of the beginning of the Berry College of Georgia. And I've often wondered how my life would have been changed had I really had been accepted for that position. I've always hoped that someday perhaps I could see the college, because I understand it is a very, very fine college now. And by fall, when the schools opened in fall, I still had no position. And the night before the schools were to open, I got a telephone call from Reverend Sibley, who had previously been a minister in Mill Valley at the Methodist Church there, and he was now out at Brockton, New York, which is out on Lake Erie. And he said, "Do you have a position?" And I said, "No, not yet." And he said, "Well, we want you out here." And I said, "Oh, are you putting in home economics?" And he said, "Oh, no," he said, "but we need a teacher for algebra and geometry." I said, "Why, Reverend Sibley, algebra was the one subject I failed in high school, the only one." And I said, I haven't looked at the geometry book since I was there. I said, I'm not trained to teach algebra and geometry. And, well, he was on the school board, and they were meeting right there in his study. Now, you see, what had happened was that up to this time, the majority of bookkeepers and stenographers were men. Well, with the war, from Washington particularly, the men had gone into service. And so teachers just left their positions and went to Washington, particularly, into the offices to work there. And as a result, it was almost impossible to get a teacher. And I said, well, so he would talk with me, and then he'd talk with the school board. And then he'd say some more. And he said, well, we want you to come up and see what we can work out. I said, well, when do you want me? He said, I want to take that morning train tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. So the next morning, I took the train from Little Valley to Dunkirk, and then the trolley out to Brockton, and met the simply got me, introduced me to the chairman of the school board, and she took me to the high school principal. Well, I found out that the teacher they had had the previous year had practically all of the algebra class fail, and practically all of the biology class failed. And I had said that if I taught anything, I would rather teach something that I had studied since I had been in high school, and I had studied biology since I had been in high school. So, but their algebra and biology classes both had. So here was a beginning class, beginning classes of algebra and beginning classes, as well as review classes. And, well, could I teach history? So I said, I'm not trained to teach any of these things. I really didn't want the job. I said, I'm not trained to teach any of these things. Well, they were quite insistent. So finally, we settled on 2 classes in algebra, 2 classes in biology, and a class in American history. But it was with the understanding that as soon as they could get somebody who was trained teaching those subjects, they were to get them. And if I got an opportunity to accept a position in home economics, that I would leave. Well, of course, that was not a very satisfactory arrangement for them. And, I would have been a nervous wreck if I had stayed there. But after about 2 weeks, they finally found somebody, a teacher, a man who came. And Reverend Sibley told me afterward, he said, you couldn't have made any worse job of it than he did, because they all failed all the classes failed the next year. But anyway, I received a call from Rochester that they were opening a school for problem girls. And the business and professional women of Rochester were opening it. And they had hired a retired teacher to be superintendent of it. And they wanted me to teach cooking and sewing to the girls. We were allowed to have only 12 girls at a time. And I always like to call it a preventatory rather than a reformatory, because most of the girls had not really gotten in trouble with the law yet. They were on the verge of it. But, well, anyway, I accepted the position and went into Rochester. Well, the home hadn't been opened, you see. It was a brand new venture, and the matron and I were having to buy the equipment and also I went to the YWCA and got a room for the period of time until we would be living out at the home. Now, this was during the time that we were having the flu epidemic that I had told about before. So on the Sunday that, first Sunday that we were there, the Red Cross called in at the home, or at YWCA, and wanted to know if there was anyone there who would volunteer to go out to a home to do anything. If you could wash dishes or clean or take care of somebody that was sick, anything, just anything. And so I volunteered to go. They came to get me and took me out, and it was this family. There was the father and mother and one little girl who was probably about 5 years old. The father was just getting over the flu. He should have still been in bed, but he was up. The little girl had been real ill, but she was better, but still in bed. And the mother was pregnant, and she was just coming down with it. Now, during that epidemic, it was quite common for them to have a miscarriage, and or if a pregnant woman went into labor, many of them didn't live, and you were really concerned about it. Well, they had called the father had called the doctor that morning because she was having some pain, and of course you just didn't know when the doctor could get there. Well, I went out there, and I remember the sink was full of dishes, and I got those washed up, and I gave the mother a bath, and I remember doing those things, and the little girl a bath, and then at noontime the Red Cross came with soup for everybody. Then afternoon came, and still no doctor. And the woman, every once in a while, she'd say, every time I cough, I think I have my baby. And of course, I was scared to death for her. If I had only thought, these were Jewish people. And in a neighborhood where these, I'm sure that if she had gone into labor, these Jewish women, some of the neighbors would have come in, but I didn't realize it at the time. Well, the Red Cross was supposed to pick me up, say 5 or 6 o'clock, I don't remember what time. And it got dark, and it got later and later, and nobody came. And they had no telephone. So finally I had to go to the neighbors and telephone, and they came and got me. Well, the next morning, when I went out to the home, before I had had a chance to tell the matron about what I had done the day before, she said, you know, I think you and I better be very careful about how we are about exposing ourselves in any way to this
flu. Of course, you've been out there the whole day before.
So I didn't tell her. I just let it ride. Well, I didn't contract the flu then. But later, I did have the flu, but not the type that they were all having at that time, so that I got over it very quickly and was not real sick. But I had it on the day that we got the false alarm that there had been an armistice. There was a false alarm just, I believe, about a week before the real one of November 11th. But all of the whole United States just went wild. People were in the streets, the whistles blew, the church bells were rung, and it was, and that was the very day that I was sick with the flu. And so I had no part in it. But so we opened home there, and the girl eventually had girls. It was a most interesting experience. Many times heartbreaking. So many times the girls were not to blame for the experiences they had had. It would be the conditions in the home. These girls, as I said, were supposed to be 12 to 16 years of age. But in the very beginning, when we had room, we took a family of 4. There really were 5 children in the family. The father had tried to keep the family together. The mother had been totally irresponsible. And she died, and the father tried to go on and hired the women to come in, as housekeepers, and then finally found out one of them, the authorities had taken her own children away from her.
No.
And so in order to make it a little easier for him to break up his family, his son went with his sister, and we took the 4 girls into the home temporarily until he could make arrangements at the orphanage where 3 of the girls went. But they were there for Christmas. And it was my first Christmas away from home, and I was so homesick. But it was a marvelous experience. This little Hazel, the youngest one of the 3 sisters who played 4 sisters, she was about 7 years old, and she had never had a doll. And at home, I had a doll that this Mary Cherry that I spoke about before had, and her mother had given me, for Mary had died, and her mother had given me her doll. And I had always treasured it and had kept it, and I thought, well, it would be so much nicer for Hazel to have that doll than for it to just be up there on the shelf. So I took it in and gave it to her for Christmas. And we had such a good time making Christmas for those girls. And Hazel, I remember one day, she climbed up on my lap, and I wore a uniform with quite a stiff collar. And she threw her arms around me and said, oh, I love you. And I said, well, why do you love me, Hazel? And she rubbed my collar and was deep in thought for a minute, and she said, I guess because you're so clean.
What a great vision, yeah.
What you thought, when you thought of what the conditions that girl had lived under, it was funny for an instant, and then it was pathetic. And her hair was so short, they had to shave it before they brought her there because it was so infested that they couldn't get the lice out of it any other way than to just shave her head. And so we really did. And the first of that month, just before the girls came there, my grandmother Bert passed away, and I went home for the funeral, but went right back. And by the way, her funeral sermon was preached by a woman, an ordained congregational minister, who had been a resident minister there at Nepali years before that. They no longer had one, but she came back for grandmother's funeral. So I stayed there for 2 years. Well, my salary was $60 a month plus my room and board. Going back to this teaching at Brockton, when I asked them what they would pay me, they said, well, I guess it would have to be whatever I said.
Boy, what an offer.
And I said, well, I knew that I was listed in our employment there for nothing under $600 a year. Now that was a good salary in those days for a teacher. I was there, I had an afternoon and evening off a week. The rest of the time I was there, 24 hours. I taught the girls cooking. They went to the public school, but I taught them cooking and sewing. But as time went on, they wanted us, Miss Whiten and me, also to follow up the girls when they went to their homes, to see how they were getting along. Well, it just kept increasing the caseload to the point that neither one of us could do it anymore. But we couldn't convince them that they needed a third person. And so in June of 1920, we both resigned and left and went to, and so before that, I had put in my application for a teaching in the Glens Falls schools. That's north of Albany in New York State, and had been accepted for the fall. So I went home, and for the summer, I meanwhile had married, and she and mother and doctor had moved to Olean. He had practiced in Salamanca previous to this, but then he changed the locations to Olean, which is about 18 miles apart. And went home for the summer. Well, I had been home just a couple of weeks when he went back out of the driveway one day and didn't see the streetcar coming. And Ruth was with him, his daughter, and the streetcar hit them, and the car ran away. It was really a double accident. The car ran away and ran into a hydrant. And he had a bad concussion and a fractured thigh. And Ruth had fractured collarbone and clavicle and a bad cut on her face. That same day, we had received word from my brother Walter that Elizabeth, their oldest child, had passed away. She had a bad heart condition, and that she had passed away. Well, the doctor and Ruth were in the hospital in Mountain Clinic, right across the street from us. And after about a week, Aunt Carrie came down on the train. And then Ed came down on Sunday, and by this time Ruth was ready to be discharged from the hospital. And so they decided to take her home with them, and he could take care of the dressings for her face and her fracture. And then the doctor, first they had to close his office and bring him over home, and they set up a bed in his reception room on the first floor. So they took Ruth home with them, and the next morning, my sister had a sore throat, and it proved to be diphtheria. Well, in those days, that was a really serious thing, and they could give your shot of antitoxin, which would last, make you immune for a certain period of time, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, something of that nature. And diphtheria has a very short incubation period. So we never knew, but we wondered if there had been somebody on the train when she came to Salamanca and became infected. So here was Ruth quarantined with her, and of course Ed was quarantined, and at that time Bertha was living with them, the young girl that they took when she was 12. And then Ed came down with it, and then Bertha did. Well, of course, we couldn't go in there, and cousin from Illinois, Jess Ashman, was there visiting, and she didn't get it, and but she stayed. They gave her the shot, and she stayed until the incubation period was over, and then the doctor let her leave. But she helped them through their most acute time, and finally, they were just desperate for help, and so I said, well, I would take a shot, and then I'd go over and help to look after them and take care of them until they were better. Ruth developed an infection in her face. She didn't develop diphtheria. But afterwards, Ed always wondered if this infection she had in her face was a diphtheritic infection. But he never had any tests made of it, and we don't know, but we've always wondered if perhaps it was. So, after 2 weeks, the doctor said that I could take Ruth and go home. And so we took the train from Randolph to Salamanca, or to Olean. And on the way to Olean, my throat began to get sore. So when I arrived, I took a taxi from the station. And when I arrived, I could see Isaac standing in the front door and then coming out onto the porch. And I said, don't come near me. I said, I'm afraid I'm coming down with diphtheria. And so I went up to my room, and she called the doctor, and sure enough. Well, after you had once had a shot, then to have it a second time, they had to be very, very careful in giving it, or you'd get a bad reaction, and it did. It affected my heart. And so the doctor quarantined me upstairs with a nurse, and Ika would prepare my meals, put them on the back stairs, and the nurse would go down and get the trays and take them up and bring them up. And here was Doctor down in the reception room, in bed with this. And meanwhile, he had gotten word that his sister had passed away. So it really was a
tough time.
A tough time that summer. And then I had to delay starting my work in Glens Falls because I wasn't discharged until later. But I went to Glens Falls, and there I had over 300 youngsters from Monday morning till Friday night, teaching sewing and cooking. And my sewing room was on 3rd floor. The kitchens were in the basement of the building, and no elevator. It left me one free period of an hour and a half to make all my lesson plans, do my shopping. And it was, and going there in somewhat of a weakened condition to begin with, and then to take over. And I had a class in, I had all of the 5th and 6th grade classes in the city who came in for sewing, all of the 7th and 8th grades for cooking, and a class of retarded youngsters as well for cooking. By February, I came down with the flu, the type that they had in 1918. Mm-hmm. And just to show you the difference in the times, here I was teaching away from home. I'd never been in the city before until I'd started there about the 1st of October, where I was late. And I have thought so many times about those wonderful people. In those days, you didn't go to the hospital unless you were just about ready to die. Uh, so where I roomed in one place and boarded in another. But the woman with whom I boarded had been a trained nurse. And she said, well, she couldn't take care of me. She was an elderly person. But she would prepare my meals. And so every day when school was out, some teacher came over and stayed with me. And one day when I was my worst, the principal's wife, who did not teach, came over and spent the day and looked after me. And then the teacher who came after school would stay until into the evening, and then another one would come and stay all night with me. And took care of me. Well, one of the teachers lived outside of Glens Falls, up in the country about 2 miles. And so as soon as I could be moved, she took me up to her home. And I stayed there until I was able to go by train back to Salamanca. I wasn't able to go back to school. And I wasn't able to teach, and I wasn't able to go back that year. So Paul, who proved to be the one who came and stayed nights with me and took me into her home, we became great friends and were. She just passed away a couple of years ago, in her 90s. And she took me to Albany. In order to go home, I had to go to Albany and then to Buffalo. So she took me to Albany and saw me out of the train there. And then my sister Ida met me in Buffalo and went with me from there down to Olean. Well, meanwhile, just about that time when I came home, the new contracts were coming out for the next year. And, oh, by the way, when I went there, I was getting $1,340, which was unheard of for the year for teaching. That was an excellent salary. And the new contracts were coming out. And before I left there, I had told the superintendent that I said, unless you can cut down on the workload here, I won't consider coming back. I said, it's just too much for one person to do. And I said, the teacher before me had to give it up because of it. But when I arrived in Olean, my brother-in-law, Dr. Henderson, said to me, well, so far as I'm concerned, you've taught the last day of school you're going to teach. And I might also say that I was very unhappy in the public school, having so many pupils. I meant nothing to any one of them. I couldn't get acquainted with them. And here I had been working on a one-to-one basis almost in Rochester. And I had written to the matron that I had worked with, and asked her if she thought, what she thought about my going back into something more like the work that we've been doing there at home. I said, I'm not happy at all with the school system. And she wrote back and she said, well, your first year will be likely to be the hardest. Why don't you try one more year and see whether you like it? So when my brother-in-law said this, you taught the last day of school you're going to teach. He said, of course, I can't tell you what you can do and what you can't do, but he said, as far as I'm concerned, you have. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And he said, I think you should get on to Philadelphia, the Osteopathic College next fall and study osteopathy. And I said, well, I could never be a doctor. And he said, well, think about it. Well, I had said many times that I would like to study nursing to know it, but I didn't want to be a nurse. But I would enjoy taking the course just to know it. Well, then I began hearing from Glens Falls again about my contract for the next year, and well, they finally would pay me $1,600 if I would come back, but I finally turned it down because I was not gaining. I had lost a great deal of weight. I slept for 14, 16 hours a day, and all I wanted, so far as food was concerned, was liquid. Anything that I could drink. But when it came to having to chew something, it wasn't that it just was repulsive to me. I didn't want it, and I just kept losing weight. And that went on for several months. And, well, it was finally very evident that I wasn't going to be able to go back. So finally, doctor said, well, why? He said, I think you will be strong enough so that you could stand the college work, even though you wouldn't be strong enough to teach. He said, why don't you go down for a year? And then, if at the end of the year you don't like it and think it isn't what you want, well, he said, then we just drop it. Well, of course, I had not had any opportunity to accumulate any means to, so far as financing myself is concerned. And he said, well, don't worry about that. He said, I'll see you through. Well, I finally decided that I'd try it. So, in the fall of 21, I went down to Philadelphia and entered College of Osteopathy at that time. Now, at that time, you had to have a high school education. It was a 4-year course. And I got a place to room and board very close to the college. I was able to get up, and our classes nearly all began at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I would get up and go to our classes. And but by the time we finished in the afternoon, I would have to come home and rest. And then I'd get up and do a little studying before dinner, and after dinner I'd study for a short period of time, and then I'd just have to go to bed. I was just so exhausted. I couldn't take part in any of the social activities at all to amount to anything. And to my amazement, I was rushed for one of the sororities. I don't know why they did it, because they had no reason to think that I would be of any asset to them. But I gradually gained all through the year. And so that by the time I came, and of course by the end of the first year, I decided I wanted to go on. And so when I went back the second year, I had regained my health and was able to take part in the activities and so forth. And in my senior year, I was telling one of my classmates about my having been so ill from the flu, and all. And he said, well, is that what happened? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I could never figure it out. He said, your first year here, you didn't participate in anything. You didn't seem to care about anybody or anything. And he said, and you came back the second year, and you were in everything. He said, I never could figure it out. And I said, well, that was the reason. I just didn't have the strength to do it. And so I put in the 4 years there. And at that time, we had very few osteopathic hospitals. We had one in connection with the college, and it was a new house, a small one, but it had only been built a few years when I went there. And so in order for anybody to have an internship, they allowed everybody, depending upon the number in your class, to serve a certain period of time. And you began at the end of your junior year. They began, so I applied for my internship. at the end of my junior year and was taken just as soon as college closed in June, so that I didn't have to go home and back again. And we had about 60 in our class, so that meant that we only got about 6 weeks of internship. But in those days, it really amounted to more than that, because you weren't on an 8-hour shift. You went at 7 o'clock in the morning, and you went home whenever you were through. It might be midnight, it might be 7 o'clock the next morning, and you just started another day.
Right.
When a patient came in, there was not a, you had to get your patient's history, you had to do their lab work. It was quite different than today, and but it had its assets too. And there were 3 of us that had an apartment together, not too far from the college, and so that I stayed there during the time that I was serving my internship. If I overslept, I usually stopped in at the drugstore, and I would get me a milkshake and have them put an egg in it, and they would usually take the milk off the top of the bottle. Mm-hmm. And I would drink that milkshake, and that would do me for the morning. And so I had the 6 weeks there. Then I went home, and in August, I was expecting a couple of friends of mine to come, and we were going up to Cuba Lake to the cottage for a time, and I stopped in Little Valley, where Arthur and his wife Lillian were living, and I found that she was in labor that morning. Mm. So I called Dr. Nolian. He had expected to deliver her, and so as long as I was there, and of course I had just completed my internship and had obstetrics and so forth, I called the girls and told them we weren't going to Cuba Lake that day, and that I was going to be spending the day in Little Valley. So I stayed